warm welcome to this very special edition of My Community. 1 shilling, 6 pence. I'm Sherwood McCaskey, thanks for joining us. Now, as we navigate the complexities of the modern world, our communities are no strangers to the impact of infectious diseases. In this episode of My Community, we look into the annals of history and we uncover a haunting parallel to our present reality. Transported back to the year 1854, we witness the chilling arrival of cholera virus on the shores of Barbados and its swift and devastating effect on community life. As we reflect on this chapter from our past, we are compelled to draw connections to the ongoing challenges posed by the current coronavirus epidemic, underscoring the resilience of our communities in the face of adversity and the enduring importance of collective action in safeguarding public health, all within our communities. Now, the coronavirus was first identified in Barbados in March of 2020. What about cholera?
May 14th, 2024 marks the 170th anniversary of the cholera epidemic in Barbados. This was when cholera struck the island, killing 20,727 people in 3 months. An alarming figure that represented 1/6 of the population of Barbados, with most of the people, the majority of the people, dying in the St. Michael area. So we have a cholera epidemic in Barbados, 1854, and it was so traumatic that during the event, the Barbadian authorities held a day of humiliation and prayer when people got down on their knees, attended churches, priests gave sermons, and it was supposed to be a day of humiliation and prayer. For me, it is the worst disaster in the history of the island. We've suffered disasters before. We've had shipwrecks, like the shipwreck of the King George, 1791, when 281 people perished in their chains off Cobbler's Rocks on the eastern coast of Barbados. We've had, of course, the 32 persons losing their lives at Pitcher Gully in 1945. But nothing compares with this epidemic of cholera that carried over 20,000 people in the space of 3 months. And it is important, therefore, that we commemorate this event, that we recognize this event, because it has left a legacy in Barbados. For example, we have this notion of the cholera ground. And we have cholera grounds in every parish, and some parish will see more than one cholera ground. We also have the many stories of cholera that we tell, and people all have their own stories. So this series helps us to peek back into history and to examine what cholera did to Barbados, how it affected the economy, how it affected the society, and most importantly, what good came out of it, and how Bridgetown was transformed, how pipe water came to Bridgetown, and how development occurred as a result of that epidemic.
And that occurred right here within our community's boundaries. The pressing question at that time was, what exactly is cholera?
Cholera is a bacterial infection. It's caused by the bacteria Vibrio cholerae. There are over 200 different types of cholera, Vibrio cholera species. But there are two main ones that can cause infections. There's cholera, Vibrio cholera 01, Vibrio cholera L-tor, and then one of the subtypes that is causing a particular issue, cholera 0139. Now, cholera is primarily transmitted by what we call the fecal-oral route, which means that it's transmitted by hand to mouth, right? Particularly hand, as if, contaminated hands with feces or so forth to your mouth. So persons have gone to the bathroom, didn't wash their hands, and then they go and prepare food or something like that, and then the person gets the infection. In cholera, it is primarily transmitted by water. So persons would have had human excrement or so in the water, and then persons can drink that water. So it's primarily spread that way because the organism is waterborne. It likes to be in water. So it is an aquatic organism. You can find it in salt water. It can also be transmitted in food. The amount that is required to be transmitted in food is a little less than what you would require for water. However, it can be transmitted by food as well. So although persons primarily think about it as being waterborne, it can also be transmitted by food. Now, cholera has been around for a long time, and they believe that Hippocrates was able to identify at least about 450 years BCE. That's when it was first identified.
As we reflect on the tense atmosphere that gripped our communities in late 2019 and early 2020 and beyond during the spread of the coronavirus, we are reminded of another epidemic that struck Barbados, cholera. What was the situation with cholera during that time?
In like 1817 to 1823, that's where the major outbreak of it happened, and it was during that time period that Barbados was similarly affected. The cholera they experienced during that time was what they call the Asiatic cholera, which is actually a very severe form of cholera.
As it relates to the coronavirus, the first outbreak occurred in Wuhan, China in 2019. What was the situation with cholera? Where did the first outbreak occur?
The infection has started out in India, somewhere close to Madras is where it has started. And, they were saying that it had started with some soldiers, and, like 500 soldiers or so became infected, and they were dying like rapidly. It's like these very healthy men just dying rapidly. Traveled along the rivers in India, and then it traveled along the coastlines from one part of India to the other, and then it was getting into Asia, the Asian countries, and then it was getting into Europe. It was getting into Spain, it was getting into Portugal, it was getting into England, and then it was getting into France.
Attacking Europe twice. It turned around on Europe 2 times.
So, in that time period, obviously, it was still the transition of persons, particularly somehow some level of slave trade, and a lot of travel in between the European countries and the Caribbean, for the owners, the colonialists and so forth. And they obviously would have been transferring some of the infections with them as they traversed.
Interestingly enough, while these events unfolded, at sea, sailors were preparing to disembark from the many ships anchored in Carlisle Bay. Professor Alan Colby, using a publication, describes the physical conditions of Bridgetown, which were conducive to the spread of that virus.
One of the interesting things that Thomas Butcher says in his book is that if you looked at Bridgetown from the sea, from a distance, it looked like a very picturesque city, because you could see the well-built breakwater, you could see the big mansions, you could see the churches, and there were tall cabbage tree palms around the city. So it looked, from a distance, it looked very picturesque. But he says when you went ashore, the illusion was soon shattered, because when you saw the houses that the common folk were living in, they were small wooden houses crammed together into these narrow lanes and alleys behind the wharves and so on in Bridgetown.
The social conditions here were dire. They were desperate. There was scarcity, there was hardship, social conditions were bad, there was abject poverty happening here. Poor sanitary conditions were also a part of the mix at the time. Provisions were scarce because of drought conditions.
There was a number of soup kitchens and meal societies that were erected before and especially during the epidemic. What was really quite striking, especially in the observations of one commentator, was the number of people who were really using that time to talk about the lack of food, the lack of sustenance and nutrition on the island. Not that I think they experienced any more of that during that period, but it was a sustained deprivation right after emancipation. So not really having enough access to food on a daily basis would have certainly created ripe opportunities for people to be in ill health to begin with, right? So you're now experiencing the ravages of contagious disease with already a sick body, an undernourished body. There was very little organized for this large emancipated population to live, work, people to raise their families in public safety in Barbados, and certainly very little was organized and funded out of the colonial budget for policies around public health, education, social security, all of these areas that we now take for granted today in an independent republic of Barbados.
So the construction for the most part was very simple. And often very in poor repair.
So people are living in squalid conditions in urban Bridgetown. A lot of people are being brought into the city looking for work, looking even to migrate out of Barbados. So that's their first stop. There's a number of these kind of squatter settlements in and around Bridgetown, and they don't have access to proper sewage, clean water. Everybody is going to communal areas to wash their clothes, to get drinking water, to bathe themselves, so for hygienic purposes, and then also to bathe their animals. So these are all communal areas where you're bringing in a number of users into those spaces, and ripe conditions really for the spread of cholera.
Of course, the other problem that Bridgetown had often was that whenever a fire broke out in one of the houses, the chances are it would spread far and wide in Bridgetown because, you know, all the houses were all made of wood and they were all close together. So there are several disastrous fires in the history of Bridgetown which are a result of that housing stock.
So Barbados doesn't have a lot of ground surface running water like there are in other Caribbean territories. We do have an aquifer system that people are aware of and could tap into, but really the plantations required quite a lot of water to supply for its industrial purposes, agricultural irrigation purposes, but also for the enslaved before emancipation, that population, and also the free population afterwards. So there was much more water sources that you see today. These would have been man-made ponds, shallow ponds on each plantation that people had access to those kinds of water sources. Then you had the springs that kind of people were aware of as well, particularly in and around Bridgetown, but across Barbados there's a number of springs that people had access to get fresh, fairly clean water. Bridgetown would have been fairly contaminated because of the number of users in that space. And then we know that you could purchase, so if you were elites living in Bridgetown, you could actually purchase water from somebody, a water carrier who would be coming through the community.
The water carried by the individuals was likely sourced from a spring that once flowed from this point here, commonly known as the Beckle Spring.
The only supply of fresh water for Bridgetown really was Beckle Spring, which was on the Bay Estate just to the south of the city. And that spring actually was used for ships in the harbour and so on as well. But it was not enough water for the whole city. So water was brought into the city in casks, filled up in the countryside and then brought in carts. And you could buy 4 gallons of water for 2 cents. But the poor folk in the city couldn't afford to spend that on water. And so they could get water wherever it was available. And they began taking water from pools and so on. Often, raw sewage had leaked into them and so forth. So the water was very, very unhealthy, to put it mildly. So all of these were fundamental problems. And it really made Bridgetown an ideal breeding ground for cholera.
And after 226 years, imagine, after 226 years of settlement in Bridgetown, no freshly piped water was coming into the city.
But Bridgetown in Barbados is a very small place, right? So you're still living cheek and jowl with people who are living in squalid conditions. And if you think about just before emancipation, your working population living in the same residence or on the same area as you, right? So those people who were attracted to Bridgetown just after emancipation, looking for work opportunities, they are squatting in communities with no air around housing. Housing is kind of really built up very informally, very next to each other, so different households next to each other. People are cooking. The environmental conditions in and around their housing is very, you can't control it because it is being done in a kind of a very informal settlement way. So it's really very frustrating, I think, to think about how that could have been, you could have intervened and controlled that. There were attempts, and particularly in the outlying areas of Bridgetown and the rest of the island, there was knowledge about how to deal with human waste, so burying it away from the house, throwing it into the sea. So there were ways of managing human waste that could potentially contaminate water sources. But if you're really thinking about how people were living, you're not living with interior toilet systems. These are people who need to take their waste and throw it out the window. Bridgetown we know is putrid and smelled terrible, and there were people who were employed to carry waste, whether it was solid waste or human waste, on carts through Bridgetown and then dispose of it in the sea. So when we think about our beautiful, pristine beaches today, I think you really have to think about how we used our beaches in the past, and they were really considered places that were wastelands, really. So living in those kinds of conditions, very small spaces, probably very leaky, especially in, like, if you had a downpour of rain, all of those, that's a potential contamination is spilling out into the streets, spilling out into the places where children play. Very crowded conditions as well. This is really, as I said, a time of great deprivation for working class Barbadians.
Well, the research reveals that much. Accurate and timely dissemination of information is important for containing any epidemic. In the case of the coronavirus, numerous COVID-19 directives were issued. How did the authorities handle the arrival of cholera here in Barbados?
During the 19th century, communication was mainly through printed press newspapers. People would receive newspapers via the ships from London, from France, or from neighboring territories in the Caribbean, like from Trinidad or from St. Lucia. And sailors would bring news verbally, as well as the passengers. They would bring news verbally. There was no radio during the time, no radio, no internet, and so on. Then we have letters. We have letters, people write letters. Now, once the news spread that cholera is in a neighboring country.
And Barbadians were fearing the worst. As a matter of fact, they had taken precautions in the 1830s against cholera.
The authorities in Barbados had fair warning that there was an epidemic on the way. There had been a major outbreak of cholera in Europe in 1847, and by 1850 it had arrived in the Caribbean. There was a major outbreak in Jamaica and in other islands, St. Croix, St. Thomas, and Nevis.
Many persons claim it started in Grenada, and from Grenada it moved across the Eastern Caribbean in neighboring St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 2,000, and all across the region, thousands. As a response to the disease, we had, for example, the soldiers in the forts, like in Grenada and in St. Vincent and the rest of the region. They were forced to leave the fort because if the disease is in the building, is in the compound, it means it's going to continue to spread. And so they were forced to evacuate the forts and to find places where there's healthy air. And this is kind of funny because usually during the colonial period, higher ground was considered to be the best place to be when you're sick because, you know, they say the air is pure the higher you go. So the cholera epidemic created havoc.
And so the authorities tried to preempt the outbreak of an epidemic in Barbados by passing an Act for the Promotion of Public Health in Barbados in February of 1851. Now that act included several measures that were designed to try and prevent or minimize the threat of a cholera epidemic. The first was that it appointed public health commissioners, acting public health commissioners, who were actually the representatives for St. Michael and Bridgetown in the House of Assembly. They were given the job of enforcing the new health regulations. Secondly, the Act required that householders should keep their houses clean of refuse.
Making sure that cesspits and cesspools were drained, making sure that people had access to knowledge about safe disposal of night soil and that kind of control of where all of your waste went and how you manage that.
Another provision was that it became illegal to keep pigs in the city because they were thought to be very insanitary. There was a regulation requiring health checks of vendors of fish and other food products to try and ensure that what they were selling was healthy. And there was a regulation that required the collection of refuse from the streets. Now, all of those things were supposed to be paid for by the vestries from the parochial funds. So these were the provisions that were put in place by that Act. And if you look at those, all of those were very sensible precautions and might have had a positive impact on preventing the spread of cholera. Unfortunately, they weren't implemented. And that was for two reasons. The first was that the acting health commissioners, of course, were also representatives in Parliament. And they didn't want to impose fines on people who were their electors. So they didn't do their jobs. The other problem was that the vestries said they didn't have the money to pay for the new health measures. And so nothing happened.
Were the directives issued during the cholera outbreak of 1854 similarly aimed at the welfare of the people akin to those issued during the corona pandemic?
I think it's really important when you look back at those kind of 1850s oriented public health measures just before the cholera epidemic. It really is to control trade. It's really about protecting trade in Barbados, not necessarily about protecting human life. It's about making sure that trade can continue even if the island comes under threat of a disease. So how you're going to quarantine ships that come into port. So Pelican Island becomes really important as this place that ships can be quarantined and people can be quarantined.
Most quarantine were 14 to 21 days. 14 to 21 days tend to be the quarantine period. And most times too, you would spend the time on ship. You would go on the small island if necessary for basic supplies, but your ship is supposed to have enough supplies to last you. And the ship would just anchor and wait until they have passed the quarantine period.
So identifying how trade will not necessarily be interrupted by these kinds of events. But of course, you can't control disease. You can't control how humans transmit disease and how disease ends up on your shores. And once it's here, you really have to think about how it will affect the human population. And secondary to that, you've now created a situation where you are limiting trade and potential economic development in the island because you haven't thought about these things in advance.
Well, on May the 14th, 1854, the first case of cholera was recorded in our communities. And it is at that point that the discussion will continue next week at the same time. 1 shilling, 6 pence. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Take good care of yourself and look out for the interests of your neighbors.